My grandfather left me an island. No HOA ever set foot on it. Then one August morning, I found bulldozers parked on my beach. 50 cabins. Built without asking me a single thing. I called the county. Already approved. For 6 months, I said nothing. I just watched. And I waited. Then a judge signed one final document, and everyone assumed I'd lost. They were popping champagne at the ribbon cutting when the trucks rolled in. Because that signature wasn't a permit. It was a demolition order. My name is Grace Whitfield, 44, a marine biologist who spent 12 years in the Coast Guard before coming home to the Georgia coast. I live alone in a modest cottage in Saltmarsh Cove, the same gated community where my grandfather Walter raised my mother. 300 yards from the private island he left only to me. Cedar Hollow Island was my grandfather's sanctuary. 12 acres of maritime forest and untouched shoreline, protected by a deed older than the HOA itself. I visited on weekends to log shorebird counts and repair his old dock. Never imagining the community that surrounded my quiet life could reach across the water and take it. Deborah Sinclair had run the Saltmarsh Cove HOA for 9 years, and she ran it like a queendom. Every fence height, every mailbox color, every rose bush needed her signature. People joked that Deborah's approval mattered more than the county's. And mostly, they weren't wrong. I clashed with Deborah before. 2 years ago, she wanted to host the HOA's 4th of July Gala on Cedar Hollow, picturing string lights and a rented yacht dock. I said no. Nesting oystercatchers needed the beach undisturbed that season. She smiled, said of course, and never forgot it. After that, small things started happening. My dock permit renewal got lost twice. My name vanished from the community newsletter's contributor list. Deborah never raised her voice. She simply rearranged the world around me. Quietly, the way water reshapes a shoreline no one's watching. She'd built her reputation on charm, hosting board meetings with sweet tea and warm cookies while burying opposition in procedural motions nobody could follow. Newer residents adored her. Longtime ones like old Mr. Petrakis just sighed and said, Deborah gets what Deborah wants. Eventually, what most people didn't know was that Saltmarsh Cove's covenant included a vague clause about shared coastal access rights to nearby waters. Language written decades ago for kayak launches and fishing piers, never meant to touch private land. Deborah had read that clause more carefully than anyone alive. Her son Marcus ran Sinclair Coastal Builders, a construction company perpetually one contract away from real success. Marcus needed a signature project, something that would put his name on brochures instead of subcontractor invoices. His mother, turned out, intended to hand him exactly that. I noticed Deborah's eyes linger on my island from her back porch more than once. The way a hawk studies a rabbit's den before deciding it's worth the trouble. When I mentioned I'd be gone all summer on a research vessel off the Outer Banks, she asked far too many questions about my return date. I should have paid closer attention. Instead, I was thrilled. A 6-month contract studying coral bleaching, a rare chance to do real fieldwork again. I packed my island house, asked a retired neighbor to check on it monthly, and told myself Cedar Hollow would be exactly as I left it. Deborah hosted a community vision meeting the week after I left, unveiling renderings of a Saltmarsh wellness retreat, 50 rustic cabins, a spa, private ferry dock. Residents clapped. Actually was. The slide simply read, Cedar Hollow Parcel, Shared Coastal Asset. A single board member, a quiet man named Todd Reyes who handled HOA finances, raised his hand and asked who owned that parcel. Deborah answered smoothly that the deed situation was under legal review and moved on before anyone could press further. Todd didn't ask again. Later, I'd learn why. Deborah had leverage on Todd, a discrepancy in the HOA's landscaping fund from 3 years back that she'd quietly covered up in exchange for his silence. It made him useful. Every HOA has a Todd, someone terrified of being the one who gets blamed. With the board's blessing secured, Deborah filed paperwork with the county describing Cedar Hollow as common association land eligible for amenity development, citing the old covenant clause and, curiously, a boundary survey that didn't match any survey on record for my grandfather's original 1987 deed. County permitting offices are understaffed and trusting of paperwork that looks official. Deborah's forms were polished, notarized, and accompanied by a prior owner consent letter, supposedly signed by my late grandfather, dated a year before he'd actually passed, when he could barely hold a pen from the stroke. Nobody at the county cross-referenced dates. The permit for 50 cabins on Cedar Hollow Island was approved in 11 business days, a speed unheard of for waterfront construction, but explainable if you knew Deborah's brother-in-law worked in the permitting office and owed her a favor from a divorce she'd once helped smooth over. By the time my research ship left port for the Outer Banks, the paperwork was already moving, quiet and unstoppable, like the first crack forming beneath ice that still looks solid from above. I had no idea. Counting bleached coral, while my island's fate was being signed away. I came home in early August, salt-crusted and sunburned, eager for a quiet week on Cedar Hollow before starting my teaching post. My neighbor Ellen met me at the marina with an odd look on her face. "Grace," she said carefully, "have you been out to your island lately?" I laughed it off. I'd been gone 6 months. Of course I hadn't. Ellen didn't laugh back. She just handed me her phone, open to a photo a kayaker had posted online. Rows of raw lumber cabin frames rising from my grandfather's tree line like a fever dream. I took my own boat out that afternoon, heart hammering harder with every wave. From half a mile off, I could already hear the whine of table saws. As I got closer, I counted the frames, not 2 or 3 test structures, but dozens, spread across nearly the whole island. I docked at what used to be my grandfather's private slip and found it widened, reinforced with new pilings, a barge tied up beside it unloading pallets of drywall. A man in a hard hat glanced at me like I was a tourist who'd wandered somewhere she shouldn't be. "Ma'am, this is a construction site," he said. "You'll need to head back to the mainland." I told him I owned the island. He laughed, not unkindly, and said, "No offense, but the HOA owns this parcel now. Got the paperwork right here if you want to see it." He handed me a laminated permit sheet. My grandfather's name was on it, dated a consent letter from a year he could no longer remember his own birthday, let alone sign legal documents. My hands shook so badly I had to set the paper down on a sawhorse to keep reading. I called the county permitting office from the dock, my voice climbing louder than I intended. A tired clerk told me the parcel was filed as HOA Common Area, developed under association authority, and that any dispute needed to go through proper channels, as if 50 buildings on my land were a paperwork typo. I motored straight back to Saltmarsh Cove and found Deborah on her porch, sipping sweet tea like she'd been expecting me. "Grace," she said, all warmth. I asked her, flatly, why there were 50 cabins on my grandfather's island. She smiled wider. "Dear. Community asset now." I told her that was insane, that Cedar Hollow had never been part of any covenant, that my grandfather's deed predated the HOA by 30 years. Deborah just tilted her head, sympathetic, and said, "I understand this is a big change. Change is hard." Proved it. She slid a folder across the table: surveys, permits, the forged consent letter, everything laminated and tabbed like she'd rehearsed this exact conversation for months. "I know it feels sudden," she said, "but think of the community benefit. A wellness retreat, right in our backyard. You'll thank me eventually." I told her I was calling a lawyer. Deborah's smile didn't waver. "Of course, honey. That's your right. Be permitted, financed, and half insured. Lawyers are expensive, and delays are expensive too. I'd hate for you to spend your savings fighting something that's already decided." That night I sat on my cottage porch, replaying every detail. The dates didn't add up. My grandfather had been in hospice the year that letter was supposedly signed. Someone had built an entire fraud on the assumption that grief and distance would keep me from checking a single calendar. I called my old Coast Guard friend Priya Patel, now a real estate litigation attorney in Savannah. She listened to the whole story in silence, then said one sentence that steadied me. "Grace, forged documents don't hold up in court. But we need proof before anyone else touches that island." Priya warned me not to confront Deborah publicly again. "Not yet. The moment she knows you're building a real case," she said, "she'll accelerate everything and bury the evidence in change orders and change of ownership paperwork. Let her think you're just an emotional woman who'll eventually give up." It was hard advice to swallow. Everything in me wanted to scream on Deborah's porch, to post the photos, to shame her publicly. But I thought of my grandfather's quiet patience, how he used to say storms pass faster when you don't fight the current head-on. I chose silence instead. The next morning, a community email went out from the HOA. "Exciting update. The Saltmarsh Wellness Retreat is officially underway on our shared coastal parcel." Neighbors replied with heart emojis. A few asked if residents would get discounted spa access. Nobody asked the one question that mattered: whose island is that? I read every reply twice, feeling something shift and harden inside me. Deborah had built her whole plan on the assumption that grief-stricken, tired, outnumbered people don't fight back. She was about to learn that a woman who'd spent 12 years reading storms for a living doesn't panic. She plans. Priya recommended a forensic document examiner named Walter Kim, no relation, who specialized in estate fraud. Within a week, he confirmed what my gut already knew. The consent letter, bearing my grandfather's signature, showed inconsistent stroke pressure and pen ink that didn't exist on the market until after his death. I also hired a licensed land surveyor, Denise Okafor, to walk the original 1987 boundary lines against the county's new filing. Her report was blunt. The updated survey Deborah submitted moved Cedar Hollow's boundary nearly 200 feet, conveniently swallowing the island whole into shared coastal access. Denise found something else buried in the county archive: My grandfather's original deed contained a rarely used clause called a sovereign exclusion, negotiated when the HOA covenant was first drafted in 1991. It explicitly barred any homeowners association claim over Cedar Hollow, forever, regardless of future covenant amendments. I sat in my truck outside the records office and read that clause 4 times, laughing and crying at once. My grandfather, decades ago, had somehow anticipated exactly this kind of overreach and welded a legal door shut against it. He just hadn't lived long enough to watch someone try the handle anyway. I didn't celebrate long. Legal argument on paper meant nothing if Deborah buried it in procedural delay, appeals, and community pressure before a judge ever saw it. Documents win cases, she said, but only if you can survive the months it takes to present them. Those months started rough. A week later, an anonymous flyer appeared in mailboxes across Saltmarsh Cove titled Community Progress vs. Personal Greed, describing an unnamed resident hoarding pristine coastal land while families wait for community amenities. Nobody signed it. Everybody knew exactly who it was about. At the grocery store, a woman I'd known for years suddenly found her cart very interesting when she saw me in the produce aisle. Another neighbor, Carl, actually stopped to say, "Grace, I get it's your land, but do you really need the whole island to yourself?" I wanted to scream that it wasn't about needing the whole island. It was about it being mine. Legally, undeniably mine. Instead I just said, "It's complicated, Carl," and kept walking, feeling 300 neighbors' worth of judgment pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. Deborah, for her part, played the wounded peacemaker beautifully at the next HOA meeting. "I know feelings are running high," she said into the microphone, eyes glistening just enough. "I only ever wanted what's best for this community. I hope Grace can find peace with sharing what she's been blessed with." Applause followed. Silent, exactly as Priya had instructed, while 30 neighbors nodded along to a woman who'd forged a dead man's signature to steal 300 yards of coastline. It took everything in me not to stand up and unravel right there. 2 days later, I received a formal HOA violation notice, unauthorized entry onto association common land, referencing my own visit to my own dock the week I'd come home. Attached was a $500 fine and a warning that repeated violations could result in a lien against my Saltmarsh Cove cottage. I photographed the notice and sent it straight to Priya, who actually laughed out loud on the phone. "She's building a paper trail against you now," she said, "to make you look like the aggressor if this ever goes to court." It's clever. Fire spectacularly. Meanwhile, construction on Cedar Hollow moved fast, faster than any legitimate 50-unit project realistically should. I learned why one humid evening when a site foreman named Ray Delgado flagged me down near the public boat ramp, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "You're the owner, right?" "The real one?" Ray asked quietly. When I said yes, he exhaled like he'd been carrying something heavy. "Ma'am, they're skipping inspections. Foundation reports, electrical sign-offs, all of it. Marcus Sinclair keeps telling us, the county already trusts us. Don't worry about the paperwork." Ray explained that Sinclair Coastal Builders had underbid the wellness retreat contract to guarantee Marcus got it, then compensated by cutting corners nobody outside the industry would notice: thinner footings, untreated lumber near the waterline, plumbing runs that violated basic code near the septic field. I need this job, Ray admitted. But I've got a kid. And I'm not going to prison for a building that collapses on some tourist in 2 years. He slipped me his number on a receipt. Said to call if I ever needed someone who'd actually seen what was happening out there. I didn't tell Ray about the lawsuit yet. Priya's warning about moving too fast still echoed in my head. But I thanked him, and something in his tired, guilty eyes told me he'd remember that I hadn't dismissed him the way everyone else in his life probably had lately. That week, I finally sought out someone else who might understand what I was up against. Retired County Judge Eleanor Voss, an old friend of my grandfather's who'd once taught me to sail as a teenager. I found her on her porch, exactly where she'd always been, tending impossible tomatoes. I didn't ask her to rule on anything, just to listen. Eleanor listened to the whole account without interrupting, then set down her tea and said, "Grace, I've seen Deborah Sinclair's name before. Ask around Palmetto Dunes sometime. You might not be the first island she's tried this on." That single sentence lodged itself in my brain like a splinter. Deborah had run another HOA years before Saltmarsh Cove, Palmetto Dunes, 2 counties south. I'd never once thought to ask what happened there, or why she'd left a community she'd supposedly loved enough to devote 9 years to. I mentioned it to Priya, who immediately flagged a research assistant to dig through Palmetto Dunes' public records and local news archive. It would take weeks to surface anything solid. But the seed was planted. This wasn't Deborah's first attempt to fold private land into shared community assets. In the meantime, the smear campaign against me sharpened. A rumor spread that I'd inherited the island through a manipulated will, that my grandfather had actually wanted it shared with the community, that grief had made me possessive and unstable. I heard it third-hand from Ellen, who looked ashamed relaying it. "I told them it wasn't true," Ellen said. "But Grace, half the block believes it now. Deborah's very convincing when she's worried about you." I thanked Ellen for her honesty and told her the truth would come out eventually. I didn't feel nearly as certain as I sounded. Deborah escalated the pressure with a settlement offer, delivered through a lawyer who specialized, tellingly, in HOA amenity development. The offer, a token payment, a guaranteed lifetime spa membership, and public credit as the generous donor of Cedar Hollow, in exchange for quietly dropping any legal challenge. I read the offer twice, disgusted at the audacity of being asked to accept a spa membership as compensation for stolen land built on a forged dead man's signature. Priya advised silence rather than outright refusal. "Let her keep thinking you're considering it. Time is currently on our side." Construction crews meanwhile poured concrete faster than the tide could rise and fall, racing toward some invisible deadline. I later learned why. Marcus had already pre-leased 12 of the 50 cabins to wellness influencers for a fall launch event, promising luxury access in exchange for social media promotion before a single inspection had cleared. One influencer's post went mildly viral. Drone footage of an exclusive island retreat. Coming this October, hashtagged with the resort's new branding, Saltmarsh Sanctuary. Comments gushed. The island's real owner had a forensic document examiner quietly building a fraud case 2 counties away. I watched that video 11 times, feeling sick and oddly powerful at once. Deborah was building a beautiful house of cards in full public view, time-stamped and screenshot-able, while believing every stacked card only strengthened her position. She had no idea she was building her own evidence file. Priya's investigator finally surfaced something from Palmetto Dunes. 8 years earlier, Deborah had similarly claimed a private marsh parcel as shared HOA wetland access for a boardwalk project, using a forged consent letter from an elderly, recently deceased landowner's estate. The project collapsed under lawsuit before completion. Deborah resigned quietly months later. The Palmetto Dunes landowner's family had settled out of court. Non-disclosure agreement attached, which explained why no news article ever named Deborah directly. But court filing indexes don't respect NDAs. Priya's team found the case number, the judge's name, and crucially, the forged letter itself, still on file. I asked Priya if we could subpoena that old letter for comparison against my grandfather's forged one. She smiled for the first time in weeks. Same handwriting analyst pattern. I'd bet my license on it. If Deborah used a template before, that's not misfortune. That's a signature crime spree. Meanwhile, my HOA fines kept accumulating. For unauthorized dock inspection. For harassing construction personnel. I'd waved at Ray once for my boat. For disruptive community conduct, after I'd calmly asked a board member a pointed question at a public meeting. The lien threat against my cottage grew concrete. Todd Reyes, the treasurer with the buried landscaping discrepancy, started avoiding eye contact with me at meetings entirely. I later learned Deborah had specifically warned him that if the truth about Cedar Hollow ever surfaced, she'd make sure his old embezzlement issue surfaced right alongside it. Time to ruin him too. I didn't know that yet, but I noticed the fear in his face, the way he flinched whenever Deborah's name came up. Ray had noticed something too. Todd sometimes lingered at the construction site after board meetings, watching, saying nothing, like a man calculating exactly how much longer he could stay silent. I finally called the investigative reporter Priya's team had mentioned, Nina Alvarez, who'd covered the Palmetto Dunes collapse years earlier for a regional paper before it folded. She now freelanced, hungry for a story with teeth. I told her everything, off the record, and asked her to simply keep watching. Nina agreed to hold the story until we had documents. Not just accusations. Papers beat feelings in a courtroom and a comment section both, she said. But she promised that the moment we were ready to go public, she'd have a headline sharper than anything Deborah's PR instincts could soften. With Nina, Ray, Denise, Walter Kim, and Priya quietly assembling pieces around me, I finally understood what my grandfather must have felt negotiating that sovereign exclusion clause decades ago, the particular patient satisfaction of building a trap so quiet the person walking into it never even hears the click. Still, the weight of public opinion wore on me daily. At the farmer's market, a woman I'd once babysat for turned her toddler's stroller a full 90 degrees to avoid passing my table. I understood, intellectually, that Deborah had poisoned the well. Understanding it didn't make the loneliness sting any less. One night I sat alone on my cottage porch, staring across the dark water toward Cedar Hollow, where construction floodlights now burned all night like the island itself had a fever. I thought about calling it quits, taking the settlement, walking away with a spa membership and my sanity intact. Then I thought of my grandfather teaching me to read tide charts as a girl, telling me the ocean always wins eventually against anything built carelessly along its edge. Not through anger, just patience, and time, and the simple, unstoppable math of water finding every weakness in a foundation. I decided that night I wasn't taking the settlement. I was going to let Deborah keep building, keep bragging, keep pre-leasing cabins to influencers, keep racking up violations against my name, right up until the exact moment the evidence, the timeline, and the county courthouse aligned perfectly against her. Autumn brought an unexpected lull. The settlement lawyer stopped calling after I quietly informed him I needed more time to think, which seemed to satisfy Deborah enough that the daily violation notices slowed to a trickle. For the first time in months, I slept through a full night. Deborah even softened publicly, telling neighbors at the harvest potluck that she understood grace was healing, and asking everyone to give her grace. No pun intended. A few neighbors laughed kindly at the joke. I heard about it secondhand and felt something between relief and deep, cold suspicion. Priya warned me this calm meant nothing legally. Deborah was simply focused on finishing construction before any real challenge could land. Storms have eyes, she reminded me. The quiet part isn't the end of the storm. It's just where you're standing right now. I used the lull productively, meeting twice more with Walter Kim, who finalized his forensic report comparing my grandfather's forged letter against the one from the Palmetto Dunes case 8 years earlier. The pen strokes, spacing errors, and even a signature flourish matched almost exactly. Same forger. Denise Okafor filed her completed survey report with the county, quietly, without fanfare, establishing on record that the updated boundary, submitted for the Cedar Hollow permit had no legitimate origin and directly contradicted the recorded 1987 deed, including the still valid sovereign exclusion clause protecting the island entirely. Ray started sending me photos through a burner phone app Priya suggested for security. Cracked foundation pours patched over with quick-dry concrete.
Electrical panels installed without permits. A load-bearing wall shortcut that violated basic hurricane code along a coastline that saw one named storm every 2 years.
They're rushing the fall launch event, Ray texted one evening. Marcus wants ribbon-cutting photos before the first cold front. I don't think this building survives a real storm season. Honestly. I forwarded everything straight to Priya, who forwarded copies to a structural engineer expert witness she'd already retained quietly. I even had a strange, almost pleasant encounter with Todd Reyes at the hardware store, where he helped me find a specific dock bolt without a hint of his usual nervous avoidance. For a moment I wondered if he might eventually be someone I could count on, rather than fear. I didn't push him. Constantly in my head now like a mantra. Don't move until the pieces align. Instead I simply thanked Todd. Mentioned offhand that I hoped the HOA's finances were in good shape lately, and watched something flicker briefly across his tired face. The neighborhood potluck that October felt almost normal. Ellen brought her famous peach cobbler. Carl apologized, awkwardly, for his producile comment months earlier. Even a few kids splashed in the community pool while their parents debated football scores instead of island ownership disputes for one blessed evening. I let myself enjoy it. Cautiously, the way you enjoy a clear sky while still watching the horizon for the next front moving in. Deborah worked the crowd nearby, laughing warmly, accepting congratulations on the retreat's almost finished progress, glowing with the confidence of someone certain she'd already won. I caught her eye once across the pool deck. She smiled at me, genuine looking, almost maternal, and raised her sweet tea in a small toast. I smiled back, just as convincingly, thinking of forged signatures and cracked foundations and a survey report already sitting quietly on file at the courthouse. That night, Priya called with the timeline we'd been waiting for. The Palmetto Dunes case number had cleared records review. Walter Kim's forensic comparison was notarized and ready. Denise's survey was on public file. The only piece missing was the county's own approval documentation, still moving through review. Once that permit review closes, Priya explained, either they catch the fraud themselves, or it sails through and we file suit immediately after using everything we've built. Either way, Grace, we're close. Weeks, not months. I hung up the phone and, for the first time in a long while, exhaled. I didn't know yet that the lull was about to end violently, that Deborah, sensing the fall launch deadline looming and some board members growing quietly uneasy, was about to make her most reckless, most dangerous move yet, one that would push everything past the point of any settlement ever maturing again. November arrived early with a stubborn hurricane still spinning far out in the Atlantic. One meteorologist kept insisting would curve away before making landfall. Marcus pushed his crews harder anyway, determined to finish the last cabins before the Wellness Retreat's grand fall launch event. Storm or no storm, Deborah sent a mass community email announcing the launch date, Thanksgiving weekend, deliberately timed for maximum visiting family and social media exposure. A gift to Saltmarsh Cove, the email read, and to Grace Whitfield, whose generous family legacy made this shared sanctuary possible. I read that sentence 3 times, stunned. She'd rewritten the entire narrative in one email. I wasn't the victim of fraud anymore. I was suddenly a generous benefactor, publicly thanked for a gift I'd never given. It was brilliant and monstrous in equal measure, the kind of narrative theft that would be nearly impossible to walk back later. Priya saw it differently. Couldn't have manufactured ourselves, she said. A dated, public, written claim that you consented and donated the land. When we prove that's false, it's not just fraud anymore. It's fraud she publicly bragged about, in writing, to 300 witnesses. I forwarded the email straight to Nina Alvarez, who called me within the hour, practically vibrating with journalistic excitement. This is the hook, she said. A community celebrating a donation that never happened, sitting on land stolen through the exact same forged signature scheme from Palmetto Dunes. Grace, this writes itself. Still, Nina held her article, waiting for the county permit review to formally close, wanting airtight documentation rather than a story Deborah could dismiss as gossip. The waiting felt unbearable. Every day the cabins grew closer to finished. Every day the launch event grew closer. Every day my patience grew thinner. Todd Reyes finally cracked under the pressure one rainy Tuesday, catching me alone in the parking lot outside the community clubhouse. Grace, he said, voice shaking, I need to tell you something before Thanksgiving. I can't keep pretending I don't know what's happening on that island. We sat in my truck out of the rain while Todd confessed everything. The landscaping fund discrepancy years earlier, Deborah's quiet threat to expose it. If he ever questioned Cedar Hollow, the mounting guilt of watching an innocent woman get publicly vilified for a crime committed entirely against her. I have emails, Todd said. Deborah directing me to approve budget transfers for the Cedar Hollow project months before any public vote happened. I saved them because some part of me knew I'd need proof someday that I wasn't the only one she'd cornered into silence. I nearly wept with relief. I called Priya immediately. Todd's emails, combined with Walter Kim's forensic signature analysis, Denise's boundary survey, and the Palmetto Dunes case file formed something Priya called a complete fraud chain, motive, method, cover-up, and pattern, all documented, all dated, all pointing directly and inescapably back to Deborah Sinclair. Todd agreed to testify if it came to that, terrified but resolute. I should have said something a year ago, he admitted. I let fear make the decision instead of doing what was right. I'm done being scared of her. I told him it wasn't too late to fix that, and I meant it, somehow. Within days, Deborah sensed a shift. She couldn't have known specifics, but she grew visibly colder toward Todd at the next board meeting, questioning his numbers publicly in a way she never had before, testing whether guilt or fear would show on his face under pressure. Todd held steady, barely, sweating through his shirt but giving nothing away. Afterward, he told me Deborah had cornered him in the parking lot, asking pointedly if he'd been talking to anyone about old HOA business. He'd lied to her face for the first time in 3 years of silence. Meanwhile, Ray reported that Marcus had started asking crew members directly whether anyone had been talking to the island lady. His nickname for me, delivered with obvious contempt. Ray denied everything, but told me afterward his hands hadn't stopped shaking for an hour after that conversation. The stakes for Ray were real. He had a young daughter, a mortgage, and Marcus controlled every contractor referral in 3 counties. If they find out it's me, Ray admitted quietly, I don't just lose this job. I lose the next 10 jobs too. I told him he could walk away anytime. No judgment. He shook his head. Ask me someday what I did when I found out people were building unsafe buildings and screwing over an innocent woman, Ray said. I want a better answer than nothing. I didn't have words for how much that steadied me. One night that week, I woke to find my dock lines cut and my small skiff drifting loose toward the marsh, saved only by a lucky snag on a submerged oyster bed. No note, no witness, nothing provably connected to Deborah, just a message clear enough that I understood it perfectly. I reported it to the county sheriff's office anyway, though the deputy who took my statement seemed distracted, mentioning almost offhand that Deborah Sinclair speaks very highly of the department's holiday fundraiser support, before suggesting the cut lines were probably just teenagers or old rope finally giving out. Priya wasn't surprised. Small communities run on relationships, she said. And Deborah's spent 9 years cultivating hers. Local law enforcement isn't going to move fast on this. We need the county civil court and the state, not a deputy who owes her a favor. I filed the incident report anyway. For the record, Nina Alvarez, meanwhile, quietly published a smaller preview piece, not naming Deborah directly yet, but detailing the unresolved Palmetto Dunes lawsuit from 8 years earlier and its startling structural and legal parallels to an ongoing Georgia coastal development dispute currently under county review. The internet connected the dots within hours. Comments flooded in under the old Sinclair Coastal Builders social pages, questioning permits, questioning ownership, questioning why an HOA wellness retreat seemed to have no public record of the actual landowner's consent anywhere except one suspiciously convenient letter. Deborah deleted comments faster than new ones appeared. She called an emergency HOA meeting that Friday, standing before 300 neighbors with unshakable composure, dismissing the article as malicious clickbait from a washed-up local reporter with an axe to grind. Most of the room nodded along, still loyal, still trusting the woman who brought cookies to every meeting. But I noticed a few faces holding back now. Ellen, arms crossed, unusually quiet. Carl, glancing between Deborah and the door like he was recalculating something. Even the retired Judge Eleanor Voss, seated near the back, watching Deborah with the sharp, patient expression of someone who'd seen this exact performance before. After the meeting, Eleanor pulled me aside. "She's good," Eleanor admitted, "genuinely good at reading a room. But good performers eventually meet an audience that's already seen the script. I think, Grace, that audience is closer than she realizes." I told her about Todd's emails. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. Impressed. "That changes things considerably," she said. "Motive and cover-up documentation from an insider is exactly the kind of evidence that turns a civil dispute into something a district attorney takes personally. I hadn't even considered criminal charges until that moment. I'd been so focused on simply getting my island back. The storm still spinning offshore finally earned a name: Hurricane Miriam. Category 2. Projected track uncertain. Forecasters split on whether it would curve harmlessly out to sea or clip the Georgia coastline directly. Marcus's crews worked through the following weekend anyway, racing the calendar instead of the weather. Ray sent me photos of workers pouring concrete in intermittent rain, skipping the standard curing period entirely to hit the Thanksgiving launch deadline. "This isn't just corner cutting anymore," he texted. "This is dangerous." West. "Some of these cabins genuinely won't hold." I forwarded it straight to the structural engineer. The engineer, Dr. Amara Osei, reviewed Ray's photos and Priya's earlier documentation and produced a preliminary report so alarming Priya read parts of it aloud over the phone. Twice to make sure I'd heard correctly. Multiple cabins showed foundation and load-bearing deficiencies capable of catastrophic failure in sustained winds over 60 miles per hour. "This isn't just fraud anymore," Priya said grimly. "If people are actually staying in those cabins during the launch weekend and Miriam turns even slightly inland, we're not talking lawsuits. We're talking potential injuries. Maybe worse. Grace, we may need to move faster than we planned." I asked Priya what moving faster meant exactly, my stomach tightening at the thought of accelerating a case Todd and Ray had risked everything to help build carefully. She explained we could file an emergency injunction requesting immediate construction halt and safety inspection, citing imminent danger, without yet revealing the full fraud case publicly. We filed that Tuesday. Hearing date. Not the immediate halt we wanted, frustratingly, but a hearing scheduled for the Monday after Thanksgiving, 4 days after the planned launch event. A bureaucratic gap that meant the ribbon cutting would proceed exactly as Deborah intended regardless. Deborah, informed of the injunction filing through the county clerk's office, called me directly for the first time in weeks. "Grace," she said, voice tight beneath the practiced warmth. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you're embarrassing yourself, and frankly, embarrassing your grandfather's memory." Something in me finally snapped hearing her invoke my grandfather's name. "You forged his signature," I said, quiet and cold. "I have the forensic report. I know about Palmetto Dunes too. You should be far more worried about your own memory right now than mine." The line went silent for a long moment. "I don't know what you think you know," Deborah finally said, "but I'd be very careful making accusations you can't prove, dear. Slander is expensive, and so are lawyers. I'd hate for you to lose everything trying to protect an island that clearly means more to you than good sense. She hung up before I could respond. I sat there shaking, adrenaline and something close to triumph mixing uncomfortably in my chest. She was rattled, genuinely rattled, for the first time since this began, and rattled people. Priya had told me once, make mistakes they'd never make calm. Deborah's mistake came fast. The next morning, HOA legal counsel filed a restraining order request against me, claiming I'd harassed and intimidated board members and construction personnel, citing Ray's occasional presence talking to me at the boat ramp as evidence of me interfering with lawful business operations. Priya laughed out loud reading it. She's trying to isolate you from your own witnesses, she said. This is desperation dressed up as legal strategy. It also, conveniently, puts Ray Delgado's name on an official court filing, which means we can now formally depose him without anyone accusing us of overreach. The restraining order request backfired further than Deborah could have anticipated. The hearing required her to specify exactly which interactions constituted harassment.
Inadvertently timestamping and detailing multiple documented moments where Ray had approached me with safety concerns. Moments now permanently part of the public court record.
I attended that preliminary hearing calmly. Priya beside me, while Deborah's lawyer struggled to articulate specific harassment beyond the presence of a construction employee near MS Whitfield on public waterways. The judge, unimpressed, denied the restraining order outright and noted the filing seemed unusually thin for its urgent framing. Deborah left the courthouse without speaking to me, jaw tight, heels clicking sharp and fast against the tile. For the first time since August, I watched her walk away first. It was a small thing. Everything. Enormous. Like watching a hawk finally lose sight of its rabbit. But small wins invite bigger retaliation from someone like Deborah. That week, the HOA board, under her direction, voted to place a formal lien against my Saltmarsh Cove cottage, citing unpaid special assessments related to shared community infrastructure, a charge invented entirely to fund the very retreat built on my stolen land. Priya moved to contest the lien immediately, calling it retaliatory and procedurally improper. But county processing meant it would sit on record for weeks regardless. A dark cloud over my only remaining property, while Cedar Hollow's 50 cabins gleamed with fresh paint just across the water. Ellen showed up at my door that evening unannounced, holding a casserole and an expression I hadn't seen from her in months. I heard about the lien, she said. Grace. I should have said something back at the potluck. I've known Deborah a long time. I think I've known her too well. Honestly, she told me something new years earlier. Before Palmetto Dunes even. Deborah had run a smaller neighborhood association in another state entirely. One that dissolved amid a vague financial irregularity. Nobody in Saltmarsh Cove ever discussed publicly. Ellen only knew because her sister had lived there at the time. I passed the lead to Priya's investigator immediately, who confirmed within days. A third HOA, a third pattern, same signature style of forged consent documents and quietly negotiated exits before anyone filed formal charges. Deborah hadn't just done this once. She'd built an entire career on doing it quietly, repeatedly, and getting away clean. Nina Alvarez, hearing the new lead, could barely contain herself on our next call. 3 separate communities. Grace, she said. This isn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This is a pattern with a body count of ruined families behind it. When we go public now, this isn't a local dispute story. This is a real investigation. Miriam, the hurricane, finally made its turn. Forecasters confirmed a direct hit on the Georgia coast was now likely. Landfall predicted for the Saturday of Thanksgiving weekend, precisely the day of the Wellness Retreat's grand launch event. Deborah, astonishingly, refused to postpone, insisting the storm would pass east. Marcus pushed back privately. Ray reported, worried about liability if anyone got hurt during a hurricane at a barely finished, uninspected construction site. Deborah reportedly told him the deposits from influencer partnerships and pre-sold weekend packages were non-refundable, and canceling now would cost more than any hypothetical lawsuit later. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A woman willing to risk actual human safety, actual lives, rather than admit the project she'd built on fraud might need to slow down. It confirmed something Priya had been telling me for weeks. Deborah wasn't just controlling. She'd become genuinely, dangerously reckless. Priya filed an emergency amendment to our injunction request, citing the imminent hurricane and Dr. Osei's structural safety report directly, requesting the county issue an immediate evacuation and construction halt order rather than waiting for the scheduled post-Thanksgiving hearing. This time, given the storm, the county moved faster. A judge agreed to review the emergency filing that same week. Not the full fraud case yet, just the safety concern, but enough to potentially force Deborah's hand before the launch weekend even began. Priya warned me not to get hopeful. Judges moved cautiously even during emergencies, and Deborah had lawyers too. Still, for the first time since I'd found bulldozers on my grandfather's beach, I felt the balance of power actually beginning to tip. The storm gathering offshore no longer felt like just a threat to me. Felt, strangely, like it might become the very thing that finally exposed everything. The emergency hearing convened by video call 2 days before Thanksgiving. Deborah's attorney arguing that Dr. Osei's structural report was unverified and biased, commissioned by a plaintiff with clear personal motive. The judge, Honorable Regina Castillo, seemed unconvinced but ultimately deferred a final ruling until after reviewing additional expert testimony. That deferral meant no immediate halt order. Construction and launch preparations could legally continue through Thanksgiving weekend while the court reviewed evidence.
A bureaucratic gap Deborah seized on immediately, doubling down on the grand opening rather than treating the delay as any kind of warning sign.
She posted publicly that evening, "Some people will do anything to stop progress and community joy. See you all Saturday for the Saltmarsh Wellness Retreat launch, rain or shine." The phrase rain or shine landed like a slap, considering Hurricane Miriam's projected landfall was now confirmed for that exact Saturday. Marcus, according to Ray, grew visibly frantic backstage, pushing crews to finish final cosmetic touches, paint, signage, staged furniture for photos, while genuine structural concerns went entirely unaddressed. "She's not listening to anyone anymore," Ray texted me. Not me. Not Marcus. Not the weather forecast. Just her own timeline. I later learned, through Todd, that Deborah had somehow discovered a security camera log showing Ray's truck parked near my cottage twice that month. She confronted Marcus privately, demanding he fire Ray immediately for compromising the project, though she stopped short of explaining exactly what compromise she suspected. Marcus, to my surprise, refused. Ray later told me Marcus had said, quietly, "He's the best foreman I've got, Mom. And firing him 4 days before launch means I've got nobody who actually knows where the problems are." It was the first crack I'd heard of between Deborah and her own son. Deborah escalated anyway, calling Ray directly, informing him his contract might not be renewed after this project, and reminding him, pointedly, that Sinclair Coastal Builders has a lot of influence with every contractor in this county. Ray recognized the threat immediately. "Stay quiet, or never work in construction here again." He called me that night, badly shaken. "I've got a family, Grace," he said. "I don't know how much more of this I can risk." I told him honestly that I couldn't ask him to sacrifice everything for my island, that whatever he decided, I'd understand and be grateful regardless. Ray went quiet for a long moment, then said something that stuck with me for the rest of that night. "My daughter asked me last week what a foreman does," he said. "I told her I make sure buildings don't hurt people. I can't keep doing this job if I stop meaning that." Meanwhile, Deborah turned her attention toward Todd, apparently sensing his allegiance shifting after weeks of subtle distance. She cornered him after a board meeting, reportedly threatening to publicly expose his old landscaping fund discrepancy at the very next community gathering unless he remembered exactly who'd protected him all these years. Todd called me shaking, terrified, saying he thought he needed to back out of testifying entirely. I told him gently that Priya could likely negotiate immunity given his cooperation and the scale of what Deborah had actually done, that his old mistake was nothing compared to years of orchestrated fraud and forgery. Priya confirmed it the next morning. Todd's minor financial discrepancy, disclosed voluntarily as part of cooperating testimony, would almost certainly be treated far more leniently than Deborah's calculated, repeated forgery scheme. Todd cried with relief on the phone, promising he was finally, fully, ready to tell the truth. That same week, someone spray-painted a single word across my cottage's front door in the middle of the night. Liar. No fingerprints. No witnesses. Security footage conveniently angled away from the street thanks to a routine camera adjustment the HOA maintenance crew had performed just 2 days earlier. I photographed everything and sent it to Priya and the sheriff both, though I no longer expected much from local law enforcement. Priya, however, saw opportunity even in vandalism. "Timestamp this alongside the restraining order filing and the lien," she said. "It builds a pattern of escalating retaliation, not coincidence." Ellen, hearing about the vandalism, showed up again unannounced, this time with her husband and a can of paint remover, refusing to let me scrub the word liar off my own door alone. "Whatever's happening," she said, scrubbing hard, "I know you well enough to know you're not one." Hurricane Miriam strengthened to a strong Category 2 by Thursday. Landfall now projected almost precisely at Saltmarsh Cove's coastline, with mandatory evacuation. Orders issued for low-lying barrier islands throughout the county, an order that, technically, should have applied directly to Cedar Hollow's newly built cabins as well. Deborah somehow secured a temporary exemption for the wellness retreat launch, citing the county's own initial, fraudulent, approval as evidence the structures met enhanced coastal resilience standards. Nobody at the exemptions office, apparently, cross-referenced that with Dr. Osei's damning structural safety report already sitting in pending court review. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. A mandatory evacuation zone with a special, Unexplained carve-out for exactly the buildings least equipped to survive a hurricane. Granted to exactly the person who'd forged the permits in the first place. Felt less like negligence now and more like something criminal. Priya agreed, filing an emergency motion directly citing the evacuation order contradiction, hoping Judge Castillo would see the obvious danger and issue an immediate halt regardless of Deborah's exemption paperwork. The judge, reviewing the filing late Thursday night, scheduled an emergency Friday morning session, one day before the storm's projected landfall. Deborah, informed of the emergency Friday hearing, reportedly told Marcus they simply needed to survive one more day before the launch made the exemption a moot point. Ray overheard her on speakerphone, telling someone, possibly her lawyer, that possession is 9/10 of the law, and by Saturday, we'll have possession. That phrase chilled me more than anything she'd said yet. She wasn't planning to fight fair or wait for a ruling. She intended to simply push through, launch the retreat, host her guests, generate her social media content, and let the courts sort out the legal mess afterward. Storm or no storm, Friday morning's emergency hearing ran long. Deborah's attorney arguing procedural technicalities about notice periods and expert witness qualifications, stalling for time the way Priya had warned me he would. Judge Castillo, visibly losing patience, finally set a firm deadline, a ruling by end of day Friday, storm timeline notwithstanding. I sat in that courtroom gallery watching Deborah's composure finally genuinely crack for the first time, jaw tight, eyes darting toward the clock, hands gripping her folder just a fraction too hard. For 9 years she'd controlled every room she walked into. This room, finally, refused to be controlled. During a recess, she approached me in the hallway, dropping the warm HOA president persona entirely for the first time since August. "You think you're clever," she said quietly, digging through palmetto dunes, turning Todd against me. "You have no idea what it costs to build something real in this world." I looked at her steadily and said the only thing that felt true. "You didn't build anything real, Deborah. You forged a dead man's signature and stole an island. Everything after that was just you trying to outrun the truth long enough to cash the check." Her expression didn't soften. It hardened. "We'll see whose truth the judge believes," she said, turning sharply back toward the courtroom. I noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she walked away, the first physical sign of fear I'd seen from her in 5 months of carefully maintained, unshakable public confidence. The recess ended without a ruling. Judge Castillo needed until the end of the day, as promised, leaving Saturday's launch event technically still legally permitted through Friday evening. Deborah left the courthouse immediately, reportedly calling Marcus to confirm the launch would proceed as planned regardless of the pending decision. That evening, against Priya's advice, I drove to the marina and took my own small boat out toward Cedar Hollow one last time, needing to see my grandfather's island with my own eyes before whatever came next. The ruling, the storm, or both changed everything permanently. Floodlights blazed across 50 finished cabins, banners already strung for Saturday's launch, catering tents secured against wind that was already picking up noticeably even a full day before Miriam's projected landfall. It looked less like a grand opening and more, unmistakably, like a countdown to disaster. I found Ray on site, overseeing final generator installations, his face etched with exhaustion and something close to dread. "They're bringing overnight staff for a storm-proofing content shoot," he told me quietly. Influencers filming themselves, battening down the hatches for social media, staying through the storm for dramatic footage. I felt genuinely sick hearing that actual people, actual guests, deliberately staying overnight in structurally compromised cabins during a hurricane, all for content, all because Deborah refused to admit even hurricane-force winds should outweigh a launch date and a batch of pre-negotiated influencer contracts. I called Priya immediately, and she filed an emergency safety alert directly with County Emergency Management, separate from the civil case entirely, hoping public safety officials might intervene where the courts hadn't yet. Emergency Management, thankfully, moved fast once informed guests planned to shelter in uninspected new construction during a hurricane. By Friday night, County Emergency Services issued a direct, mandatory evacuation notice specifically naming the Cedar Hollow parcel, overriding Deborah's earlier exemption entirely on public safety grounds, citing the pending structural report and confirmed hurricane landfall timeline. It wasn't the fraud ruling we needed, but it was something. Deborah, informed of the mandatory evacuation override late Friday night, reportedly became unhinged, according to Marcus, who finally, quietly, called Priya's office directly himself, the first time anyone in the Sinclair family had reached out to my side rather than the other way around. Marcus told Priya he'd tried for months to raise safety concerns privately with his mother and been dismissed every time. He said he was terrified of prison, terrified of a guest getting hurt, and finally more terrified of Deborah's recklessness than of losing his mother's approval or his business's reputation. He offered to testify too about the cut corners, the skipped inspections, the pressure his mother had applied throughout, framing himself as complicit but coerced rather than the true architect of the fraud. Priya, cautiously, said his testimony combined with Todd's would make Deborah's defense nearly impossible to mount. I felt an unexpected pang of something like pity hearing about Marcus's confession. A grown man finally admitting, 5 months too late, that he'd known all along something was deeply wrong, and chosen his mother's approval over doing the right thing until fear, finally, outweighed loyalty. Deborah, unaware her own son had turned, spent Friday night making frantic calls, according to Todd, trying to find any county official willing to override the emergency evacuation notice, offering favors, invoking old friendships, growing increasingly desperate as door after door quietly, politely, refused to open for her anymore. By midnight, most of the pre-booked influencer guests, informed directly by county emergency services rather than the HOA, canceled their overnight stays entirely, unwilling to risk a hurricane in a building the county itself had just publicly flagged as unsafe. Deborah's carefully staged, storm-proofing content shoot collapsed before it even began. I stayed up that whole night, watching Miriam's projected path tighten on the news, watching my phone buzz with updates from Priya, from Ray, from Todd, from, astonishingly, Marcus himself now, everyone converging toward the same inevitable point. Tomorrow, one way or another, everything would finally come apart. Judge Castillo's ruling arrived by email at 6 the next morning, hours before Miriam's expected landfall. An immediate, full construction halt on Cedar Hollow Island, pending review of the forensic fraud evidence and structural safety report, effective instantly, overriding any prior permit entirely, citing substantial likelihood of fraud and imminent danger to public safety. I read the ruling standing in my kitchen at dawn. Hands shaking, tears finally coming after 5 months of forcing myself to stay calm. Patient. Methodical. It wasn't the final fraud verdict yet. But it was the first time in this entire ordeal that the law had officially, unmistakably, sided with me. Deborah received the same ruling minutes later. According to Todd, who happened to be on a call with her when her phone buzzed with the notification. He said she went completely silent for nearly 30 seconds before saying, quietly, almost to herself, "This isn't over. It's not going to be over." I looked out my window toward the darkening horizon. Wind already picking up. The first outer bands of Hurricane Miriam beginning to lash the coastline. And understood with sudden clarity that Deborah was right about one thing. This wasn't over. It was, finally, about to reach its actual conclusion. Local emergency broadcasts urged all remaining residents near Saltmarsh Cove to evacuate inland by noon. Hours before Miriam's I was expected to cross the coastline directly. Priya called at 7, urging me to leave for Priya's own inland office instead of staying anywhere near open water. I told her I would, soon. First, though, I needed to know Ray had actually left the island safely. He answered on the second ring, shouting slightly over rising wind, confirming his crew had evacuated hours earlier per the county order. Except for a single generator technician, Marcus insisted stay behind, just in case. That detail nagged at me. Marcus, cooperating fully now, wouldn't reasonably endanger an employee for no reason unless someone above him, Deborah, had specifically ordered it. I called Marcus directly. He answered sounding hollow, exhausted, admitting his mother had driven out to the island herself that morning. Alone. Against every warning. She wouldn't listen, Marcus said. She said she needed to secure important documents from the site office before anyone else could access them under the court order. I told her it was insane with the storm coming. She told me I didn't understand what she'd built or what she stood to lose. I felt cold understanding settle over me immediately. Deborah wasn't going out there for paperwork. She was going out there to destroy evidence before the court-ordered halt allowed investigators full access to the site. Racing a hurricane to erase whatever remained of her fraud before anyone could formally seize it. I called Priya, breathless, explaining everything. Priya, alarmed, immediately contacted both the sheriff's office and county emergency management, explaining that a person was reportedly on Cedar Hollow Island during a mandatory evacuation, potentially attempting to destroy evidence relevant to an active fraud investigation. Hours before hurricane landfall, the sheriff's office, previously so reluctant to act on my behalf, moved considerably faster once framed as an active welfare check during a hurricane evacuation. A category of emergency nobody in local law enforcement could politely ignore, regardless of whose name was attached to the community fundraiser gala. I told Priya I was going out there myself. She argued fiercely against it. Grace, that's a hurricane, not a courtroom. Let the professionals handle this. But something in me, watching my grandfather's island one final time potentially, refused to sit safely inland while Deborah tried to erase the truth. I called Ray, who insisted on coming with me despite my protests, saying he knew the water and the dock better than any sheriff's deputy unfamiliar with the site. We took my boat, waves already choppy and unpredictable, the sky darkening to a bruised, heavy green that every coastal local recognizes and fears instinctively. The crossing felt endless. Wind shoving against the hull. Rain beginning in stinging sheets even before the true storm bands arrived. I kept thinking of my grandfather crossing these same waters decades earlier, teaching me to respect the ocean's patience. Never its mercy, because the ocean has none to offer. We reached the dock just as the sheriff's patrol boat arrived from the opposite direction. Deputies shouting instructions over the wind, confirming they'd received Priya's report and were there for a welfare check specifically. Ray guided our boat expertly alongside theirs, tying off fast against the rising chop. Inside the site office, a temporary trailer near the finished cabins, we found Deborah exactly where Marcus feared she'd be, feeding papers frantically into a small portable shredder, boxes of files stacked beside her, half loaded into her car despite the rain already soaking everything through the open door. Deborah Sinclair, one deputy, called out over the wind. County emergency order requires immediate evacuation. You need to come with us right now. Deborah didn't stop shredding. Give me 5 more minutes, she snapped, not even looking up, feeding another stack of pages through the whirring blades. I stepped into the trailer doorway, rain soaking through my jacket, and said the only thing that felt necessary after 5 months of silence. It's already too late, Deborah. Priya filed everything with the county this morning. Whatever's in that shredder, we already have copies. You're just destroying evidence now. On video, her head snapped up, and for one unguarded second, I saw something underneath the composed HOA president mask I'd never seen before. Pure, cornered panic. The look of someone realizing every carefully built lie was collapsing simultaneously, faster than she could shred paper fast enough to stop it. You don't understand what I built here, she said, voice cracking now. Finally, after 9 years of unshakable calm. 9 years, Grace. 9 years of running this community, making it beautiful, making it work. And you and your little island are going to take all of that away from me. I didn't take anything, I said. You forged my grandfather's signature. You stole my land and lives for a launch event during a hurricane. Whatever you built, Deborah, you built it on a lie, and lies collapse eventually. That's not me taking something. That's just the truth catching up. The deputy stepped forward, firm now, unwilling to let the exchange continue. Ma'am, I need you to step away from that equipment and come with us. This isn't optional anymore. Deborah finally straightened, smoothing her soaked blouse with trembling hands, some final vestige of composure fighting to reassert itself. This is harassment, she said, voice regaining some practiced steadiness even now. I have rights. You'll be hearing from him. The deputy, unmoved, simply gestured toward the door. You can call your attorney from the boat, ma'am. Right now, we need everyone off this island. Outside, the wind had climbed noticeably even in the few minutes we'd been inside. Rain now horizontal, the first genuine outer bands of Miriam finally arriving in earnest. Ray checked the boats anxiously, shouting that we needed to move immediately if we wanted a safe crossing back to the mainland. The deputies guided Deborah toward their patrol boat, her half-shredded files left behind, sodden and abandoned in the trailer doorway. She glanced back once at the 50 finished cabins around her, her wellness retreat, her legacy project, already beginning to groan audibly under wind loads they were never actually built to withstand. I heard it before I fully understood what I was hearing. A deep structural creak, then a sharper crack, as one of the nearer cabins, corners cut exactly as Dr. Osei's report had warned, buckled slightly at its foundation under a sudden gust, a support beam visibly shifting out of alignment. "We need to go now," Ray shouted, already pulling me toward our boat as the deputies hurried Deborah toward theirs. Nobody argued further. Whatever satisfaction I might have imagined feeling watching Deborah's fraud collapse evaporated instantly, replaced by pure animal urgency to simply survive the crossing back to safety. The ride back felt even worse than the crossing out. Waves cresting higher now, rain reducing visibility to almost nothing, Ray navigating from memory and instinct more than sight. I gripped the rail hard enough to bruise my palms, thinking absurdly, in that moment, only of whether Priya had eaten lunch yet. We made it to the marina just as the harbor master ordered the last boats out of the water entirely. Miriam's I now less than 2 hours from landfall according to the radio crackling from someone's truck nearby. Deborah's patrol boat arrived minutes after ours. Deputies escorting her, soaked and silent, toward a waiting cruiser. She didn't look at me as they walked her past. For the first time in 5 months, Deborah Sinclair had absolutely nothing to say, no smooth reassurance, no wounded peacemaker performance, no laminated folder of paperwork to slide calmly across a table. Just silence, rain, and the distant sound of cabins groaning across the water. I called Priya from the marina parking lot, shouting over the wind to be heard, explaining everything that had happened. She was quiet for a moment, processing, before saying, "Grace, destruction of evidence during an active investigation. Combined with everything we already had, this isn't a civil case anymore. This is criminal. Fully." Nina Alvarez called minutes later, having heard secondhand through county emergency scanner chatter that the HOA president was detained during a hurricane evacuation. I gave her the outline, promising full details once the storm passed. "Grace," she said quietly, "this is the story I've been chasing for 8 years. Thank you." I drove inland to Priya's office as instructed, watching Miriam's outer bands lash the coastline behind me in the rearview mirror, wondering how many of those 50 cabins would even still be standing by morning, wondering whether their collapse would end up being the final, undeniable proof nobody could argue away. Todd called that evening, shaken but steady, confirming he'd formally submitted every saved email to Priya's office and, separately, to the county district attorney's fraud division, which had opened an active criminal inquiry the moment word of the shredded evidence and forged signatures reached their desk that same stormy afternoon. Marcus called too, his voice hollow but resolved, confirming he'd retained his own separate attorney and intended to cooperate fully, hoping honesty now might soften whatever consequences awaited him for the corners he'd cut under his mother's relentless pressure over the preceding months. I sat in Priya's office that night, watching news coverage of Hurricane Miriam making landfall exactly where forecasters predicted, wind howling outside, and felt something unfamiliar settle over me for the first time since August. Not triumph exactly, not yet, but the quiet, steady certainty that the truth had finally, undeniably, broken through. Morning broke gray and waterlogged over Saltmarsh Cove. Hurricane Miriam finally spent somewhere inland, leaving behind toppled trees, flooded roads, and, as county inspectors confirmed by midday, 3 of Cedar Hollow's 50 cabins fully collapsed. Another 11 structurally condemned, exactly where Dr. Osei's report had predicted failure. County building inspectors, arriving for mandatory post-storm assessment, documented everything in exhaustive photographic detail: cracked foundations, exposed untreated framing, electrical panels submerged in standing water because they'd never been properly elevated per code. It was, one inspector told local news, some of the worst construction shortcuts I've seen in 20 years. The district attorney's office, already investigating the shredded documents and forged signature evidence, moved swiftly once the physical collapse confirmed everything Dr. Osei and Ray had warned about for weeks. By Monday morning, formal charges were filed against Deborah Sinclair: forgery, fraud, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering. Nina Alvarez's full investigative article dropped that same Monday. Headline blunt and devastating: the HOA Queens Island Empire, forged signatures, buried fraud, and a pattern 3 decades in the making. It detailed Palmetto Dunes, the Mystery Out-of-State Association, and Cedar Hollow in exhaustive, meticulously sourced detail. Within hours, comments and messages poured in from Palmetto Dunes residents Nina had tracked down years earlier, finally willing to speak on record now that Deborah's pattern had been publicly, undeniably exposed elsewhere. One elderly widow described losing her late husband's marshfront property to nearly identical forged paperwork. Never fully compensated. I read that woman's account 3 times, tears coming unexpectedly. I hadn't just stopped Deborah from stealing my island. I'd inadvertently given a voice to people who'd been quietly harmed by her years before I ever knew her name. People who'd assumed, like I once had, that their case was simply bad luck. Saltmarsh Cove itself fractured into open, public reckoning. Neighbors who'd nodded along at HOA meetings for years suddenly filled community forums with stories they'd previously kept quiet. Small procedural bullying, mysteriously lost permit applications, fines that always seemed to target whoever had recently crossed Deborah in some small way. Ellen posted publicly, finally, apologizing for ever doubting me, admitting she'd known Deborah's temper firsthand years earlier over a fence dispute and had simply been too afraid of retaliation to speak up sooner. Carl posted something similar. Even a few residents who'd signed the anonymous Community Progress flyer came forward. Ashamed, the HOA board, without Deborah, held an emergency session that week, voting unanimously to suspend her indefinitely pending trial and formally rescind every document, permit, and community statement related to Cedar Hollow's development. Todd, promoted temporarily to acting president. Read the resolution aloud with visible, hard-earned steadiness. I attended that meeting, invited for the first time in months as something other than a suspect or a nuisance. Neighbors actually applauded when Todd finished reading. Felt surreal, almost dizzying, after 5 months of casseroles left cold on my porch and rumors about my supposed instability. Priya, meanwhile, filed the full civil fraud case formally, combining every piece of evidence gathered over 5 months: Walter Kim's forensic signature analysis, Denise Okafor's boundary survey, Todd's emails, Marcus's cooperating testimony, the Palmetto Dunes case file, And now the collapsed cabins themselves as physical proof of the danger. Deborah, out on bail within days, attempted one final public counterattack, giving a tearful local news interview claiming she was a scapegoat for a community's own greed.
That she'd only ever tried to give Saltmarsh Cove something beautiful. And that
The interview backfired catastrophically. Viewers, primed by Nina's article and the collapsed cabin photographs circulating everywhere, flooded the station's comment section pointing out the obvious. Nobody forges a stroke victim's signature out of community generosity. The narrative Deborah had controlled so masterfully for years finally, completely, stopped working. Marcus gave his own separate interview days later, quieter, more measured, admitting fully to the corners cut under pressure, expressing genuine remorse for the guests who'd nearly been endangered, and stating plainly that his mother had directed every major decision regarding Cedar Hollow from the very beginning. It was, Priya said, exactly the kind of corroborating testimony that transforms a strong case into an airtight one, a co-conspirator publicly, voluntarily confirming details that match Todd's emails, Ray's photographs, and Dr. Osei's structural report almost perfectly, leaving Deborah's defense attorney very little room left to maneuver. The preliminary criminal hearing, held 3 weeks after the storm, drew a courtroom gallery packed with Saltmarsh Cove residents, several Palmetto Dunes victims, who'd driven 2 hours to attend, and Nina Alvarez taking careful notes from the press bench, finally covering the story she'd waited 8 years to finish. Walter Kim testified first, methodically walking the court through his forensic comparison, the mismatched ink chemistry, the inconsistent pen pressure, the signature template matching almost exactly the forged Palmetto Dunes letter from 8 years earlier. Deborah's attorney's cross-examination barely dented the technical precision of his findings. Denise Okafor testified next, presenting her survey findings alongside the original 1987 deed and its sovereign exclusion clause, explaining clearly how the updated boundary survey, submitted for Cedar Hollow's permit, had no legitimate surveying basis whatsoever, essentially fabricated to justify claiming land the HOA covenant explicitly, permanently excluded. Todd testified after lunch recess, visibly nervous but steady, reading portions of Deborah's emails directing budget transfers for the Cedar Hollow project months before any legitimate board vote occurred, and describing, in detail, her threat to expose his old financial discrepancy if he ever questioned her authority publicly. Marcus testified last that day, his voice occasionally cracking as he described his mother's escalating pressure to cut corners, her dismissal of his safety concerns, and her decision to drive out to the island during a mandatory hurricane evacuation specifically to destroy evidence before investigators could access it. I testified the following morning, walking the court through everything from finding bulldozers on my beach to the shredded documents in the storm-battered trailer, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage while describing 5 months that had cost me my sense of safety, my community standing, and nearly my grandfather's legacy. Deborah's attorney tried, briefly, to paint me as an absentee landowner who'd abandoned the island for months at a time, suggesting some implicit consent through neglect. Priya's cross-examination dismantled that argument in under 3 minutes, pointing out that a research contract abroad isn't legal consent to forged signatures. The judge, reviewing everything presented over those 2 intense days, found sufficient evidence to proceed to full criminal trial on all counts: forgery, fraud, obstruction, and reckless endangerment tied to the near-catastrophic launch event plan during a confirmed hurricane. Deborah's bail conditions tightened. Her passport was surrendered. Priya, meanwhile, pushed the parallel civil case toward a faster resolution, arguing the criminal proceedings had already established overwhelming documentary proof of fraud, making a prolonged separate civil trial unnecessary when a summary judgment motion could resolve ownership and demolition questions considerably faster. Judge Castillo, the same judge who'd issued the emergency construction halt before the storm, agreed to hear the civil summary judgment motion within the month, recognizing the extraordinary volume of corroborated evidence already on record from the criminal preliminary hearing, plus the undeniable physical evidence of 3 collapsed cabins. In the weeks leading up to that civil hearing, something unexpected happened. Deborah's defense attorney reached out to Priya privately, exploring whether a negotiated plea and settlement might resolve everything faster, sparing Deborah a lengthy public trial in exchange for full restitution, demolition cooperation, and a formal guilty plea on reduced charges. I sat with Priya discussing the offer carefully. Part of me wanted the full public trial, wanted every detail exposed in open court for the world to witness. But Priya reminded me that a guaranteed guilty plea, full financial restitution, and immediate legal clearance to demolish those unsafe cabins might serve me better than months more uncertainty. I thought about my grandfather, about his patient sovereign exclusion clause negotiated decades ago. Quiet and precise rather than dramatic. I decided he would have chosen the guaranteed, decisive outcome over the theatrical one. I told Priya to negotiate the plea, provided demolition authority and restitution were absolutely non-negotiable terms. Negotiations took another 2 weeks. Contentious at times, Deborah's attorney pushing for reduced restitution amounts and lighter sentencing recommendations. Priya held firm, backed by the sheer weight of evidence, reminding them repeatedly that a full public trial would only expose additional details currently still private, including the full extent of the Palmetto Dunes settlement. Finally, Deborah agreed to plead guilty to forgery, fraud, and obstruction of justice, in exchange for the reckless endangerment charge being reduced, full financial restitution to me and to the original Palmetto Dunes family, a permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association board in the state, and immediate demolition clearance. The formal plea hearing was scheduled for late January, giving the community, and me, a strange stretch of holiday season to simply exist in the uneasy quiet between wreckage and resolution. Cedar Hollow sat abandoned across the water throughout that time. Damaged cabins slumped and empty, waiting for their court-ordered end. I visited the island once during that lull. Alone, walking carefully around condemned structures still standing where my grandfather's maritime forest used to stretch unbroken to the shoreline. It looked like a wound. Honestly, beautiful land scarred by someone else's greed, waiting patiently, the way land always waits, to heal. Ray visited too, separately, unable to stay away from a sight that had cost him so many sleepless nights of conscience. He found me there one afternoon and we stood together quietly at the damaged dock. Not saying much, just acknowledging everything we'd both risked to get to this exact moment. I keep thinking about what happens to these cabins, Ray admitted. All that wasted material, wasted labor, feels almost like a shame, even knowing they were never safe. I told him I understood, but that some things built on a lie simply can't be salvaged, no matter how much effort went into them. Todd, now permanently elected HOA president after Deborah's suspension became formal removal, reached out that December asking if I'd be willing to help draft new community bylaws preventing exactly this kind of unchecked authority from ever concentrating in one person's hands again. I agreed, grateful for the chance to help rebuild something. We spent several evenings together, drafting term limits, mandatory independent audits, and a clear, unambiguous process requiring any land use claim to undergo external legal review before ever reaching a community vote. Todd, once so terrified of Deborah's shadow, seemed almost lighter with every new safeguard we added. Nina published a follow-up piece that December detailing the community's reform efforts, framing Saltmarsh Cove's response as a small model for how HOAs nationwide might prevent similar concentration of unchecked power. The article generated modest national attention, a few other communities reportedly reaching out to Todd for guidance. I received an unexpected letter that same month from the elderly Palmetto Dunes widow Nina had first written about, thanking me for pursuing the case that finally exposed a pattern she'd assumed, for 8 lonely years, had simply been her own bad luck rather than someone else's calculated theft. I wrote back, telling her honestly that her earlier case, buried under a non-disclosure agreement, had been crucial evidence in stopping Deborah from doing it a 4th time. Her fight, silenced for years, had ultimately helped win mine. It felt like the truest kind of justice, quiet, connected, and long overdue. Christmas came and went strangely quiet. My first holiday season back on solid, uncontested ground since inheriting Cedar Hollow years earlier. I spent it with Ellen's family, with Priya flying in briefly from Savannah, with Ray's daughter proudly showing off a school project about buildings that keep people safe. By late January, as the plea hearing date finally arrived, I felt something I hadn't expected after 5 exhausting months of fear, isolation, and quiet strategic patience, a strange, settled calm, the specific kind my grandfather used to describe as the stillness right before the tide finally turns for good. The plea hearing filled the courtroom to capacity. Media present. Palmetto Dunes families seated beside Saltmarsh Cove neighbors who'd once doubted me. Deborah entered in a plain gray suit. No jewelry. No warm HOA president smile. Looking smaller somehow than the woman who'd once slid laminated fraud folders across her porch table. Judge Castillo read the formal charges aloud methodically. Forgery of a legal document. Fraud in the inducement. Obstruction of justice through evidence destruction. And reckless endangerment reduced per the negotiated plea. Deborah stood as instructed, her attorney beside her, and answered guilty to each count in a voice barely above a whisper. I watched her carefully during that moment, searching for some flicker of the composed, dangerous confidence she'd carried for 9 years running Saltmarsh Cove. I found instead only exhaustion, the specific hollow look of someone who'd finally run out of rooms left to charm, out of paperwork left to slide across tables. Judge Castillo, accepting the plea, moved to sentencing terms already negotiated. Full financial restitution covering demolition costs, legal fees, and damages to me directly. Separate restitution to the original Palmetto Dunes family, whose case had been quietly settled years earlier. And a permanent, statewide ban from serving on any homeowners association board. The judge added, notably, a suspended prison sentence contingent on full compliance with restitution terms and community service, not the courtroom drama some spectators had perhaps hoped for, but exactly the outcome Priya had predicted for a first-time criminal defendant with no prior record, however extensive her prior civil pattern. Crucially, the judge granted immediate court authorization for demolition of all 50 structures on Cedar Hollow Island, citing both the confirmed fraud and Dr. Osei's structural safety findings, ruling the buildings posed ongoing danger regardless of ownership resolution and needed removal before any further storm season arrived. I sat in that courtroom holding the exact ruling I'd waited 5 silent, patient months for, not just an acknowledgement that Cedar Hollow was legally mine again, restored under my grandfather's original sovereign exclusion clause, but explicit legal authority to tear down every single thing built there without my permission. Deborah's attorney requested a brief statement from his client before sentencing formally concluded. Deborah stood again, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, looked directly at me across the courtroom. "I built something beautiful," she said quietly.
"I just built it on land."
It wasn't quite an apology. Not really, but it was the closest thing to honesty I'd heard from her in 5 months. I didn't respond. That the judge's ruling and Dr. Osei's report and Walter Kim's forensic analysis hadn't already said far more thoroughly than I could. Marcus, sentenced separately the following week for his lesser cooperating role, received probation, mandatory professional ethics training, and permanent revocation of his contractor's license in the state, effectively ending Sinclair Coastal Builders entirely. He didn't contest any of it, telling the court plainly he understood exactly what he'd allowed to happen. I ran into Marcus once more, weeks later, at the county building permit office, both of us there for unrelated paperwork. He looked older, quieter, genuinely humbled. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "For all of it." First time I noticed the corners we were cutting. I told him honestly that I appreciated him finally coming forward, that it had mattered, that people telling the truth even 5 months too late still mattered more than staying silent forever. He nodded, thanked me, and left without trying to explain or excuse anything further. Felt, oddly, like enough. Demolition began in early February. A specialized coastal deconstruction crew, not Sinclair Coastal Builders, carefully dismantling all 50 structures over 3 methodical weeks, salvaging what materials could be safely reused and clearing the rest entirely, restoring Cedar Hollow's shoreline piece by piece to something resembling its original, undisturbed condition. I watched the first cabin come down from my boat, floodlights and heavy machinery replacing the launch event banners and catering tents that had once stood in almost the exact same spot. It felt less like destruction and more like exhaling after holding my breath for 5 straight, exhausting months. Ray, ironically, ended up supervising part of the demolition himself, hired directly by the deconstruction company once word spread of his cooperation and his genuine expertise with the site. "Feels good," he told me one afternoon, watching a crane lift away a warped support beam, actually fixing something instead of just documenting it breaking. Todd stopped by occasionally too, now firmly established as Saltmarsh Cove's reform-minded HOA president, overseeing the community's new bylaws requiring independent legal review for any future land use proposal. He told me the board had unanimously voted to formally, publicly apologize to me at the next community meeting. That apology, when it came, felt strange to receive. 300 neighbors, many of whom had doubted me, avoided me, believed rumors about my stability over months of careful gaslighting, standing to offer genuine, uncomfortable acknowledgement of how thoroughly they'd let one charming, controlling woman shape their judgment against an innocent neighbor. I accepted it graciously, though privately I understood some scars simply take longer to fade than a formal community resolution can address. Ellen hugged me afterward, tearfully apologizing again despite having already done so months earlier, and I told her, honestly, that her honesty when it finally came had mattered enormously. By late February, Cedar Hollow's shoreline stood empty again, replanted with native marshgrass and young live oak saplings under Denise Okafor's restoration guidance. The maritime forest my grandfather had protected slowly beginning its long, patient return to something resembling what it had been before anyone ever tried to steal it. I received Deborah's first restitution payment that same week, processed through Priya's office, a number that would never fully compensate for 5 months of fear, isolation, and vandalized doors, but represented, at least, formal legal acknowledgement of exactly how much she'd taken and exactly how thoroughly she'd been made to give it back. Nina Alvarez's final article in the series ran with a simple headline, Cedar Hollow Restored, How One Coastal Fraud Finally Met Its Reckoning.
It detailed the entire arc from forged signature to courtroom plea, closing with an interview from the Palmetto Dunes widow. Finally, fully vindicated after 8 silent years.
I read that final article alone on my cottage porch, looking out across calm water toward an island finally, truly mine again, undisturbed and quiet exactly, as my grandfather had left it to me. I thought about how patient he'd been decades earlier, building a legal safeguard he never lived to see actually used. Priya called that evening to confirm the case was formally, completely closed, restitution processing, demolition complete, Deborah's sentencing finalized, the civil ownership dispute resolved permanently in my favor under the original sovereign exclusion clause. You did this the hard way, she said. Quiet, patient, methodical. Your grandfather would be proud. I thought about those words for a long time after we hung up. 5 months of staying silent while Deborah built her fraudulent empire in plain sight. 5 months of gathering evidence instead of screaming from rooftops. 5 months trusting that patience and documentation would eventually outlast charm and manipulation. Finally had. Todd's reformed HOA board invited me to a small, informal gathering that March, marking the community's first anniversary since everything began unraveling. Ellen brought cobbler again. Carl brought actual, sincere conversation instead of awkward avoidance. Even Marcus, invited quietly by Todd, showed up briefly, keeping mostly to himself near the punch bowl. I stood on the dock that evening, looking out across calm water toward Cedar Hollow's slowly healing shoreline. Native grasses already taking root where 50 fraudulent cabins had briefly, arrogantly stood. Ray joined me quietly, his daughter running along the shore nearby, and said simply, "Your grandfather built you a good trap." I laughed for the first time in what felt like a genuinely long while. "He built me patience," I said. The trap was just what patience looks like when somebody finally tries to test it. Ray nodded, and we stood there together, watching the tide slowly, steadily reclaim what had always, rightfully, been mine. Spring arrived fully by April. Cedar Hollow's shoreline greening over completely, shorebirds returning to nest exactly where construction crews had once poured rushed, uninspected concrete. I spent my weekends there again, logging bird counts just as I had before Deborah ever set eyes on my grandfather's quiet, protected sanctuary. Deborah completed her community service requirements that spring at a county recycling center. Several residents reported seeing her there, quiet and unrecognizable compared to the commanding HOA president who'd once controlled every fence height and rose bush color in Saltmarsh Cove. Nobody, notably, invited her back to any community gathering. Todd's reformed bylaws held strong through their first full year, successfully blocking 2 separate attempts by outside developers to claim shared waterfront access elsewhere in the community. Proof that patient, careful structural changes could outlast even the most charming, determined manipulation eventually, permanently, if people simply stayed vigilant. Marcus, license revoked permanently, took a quiet job managing inventory at a regional hardware supply warehouse, occasionally sending Ray project advice on safe construction techniques, apparently determined, in his own small, humbled way, to make something honest out of whatever remained of his ruined career. I still keep my grandfather's original 1987 deed framed on my cottage wall now, the sovereign exclusion clause highlighted in faded yellow marker, right beside Judge Castillo's final demolition order, 2 documents, decades apart, proving that patience, properly aimed, always eventually outlasts even the most confident, calculated fraud. Cedar Hollow Island stands quiet again, exactly as my grandfather intended, exactly as I intend to keep it, protected, undisturbed, and entirely, permanently mine. Some battles you win by shouting loudest. Others, I learned that year, you win simply by staying patient long enough to watch the tide finally turn.